The small-town courthouse was alive with the usual morning buzz. Lawyers shuffled papers, their leather briefcases creaking as they opened and closed. Spectators whispered to each other, leaning in close so their voices wouldn't carry too far. The air smelled faintly of old wood and polished floors, a scent that always seemed to linger in places like this. It was just another day for most people, another round of legal arguments, testimonies, and rulings, but not for the man sitting nervously on the wooden bench near the back. This man's name wasn't important yet, but his story would soon become one everyone talked about. He was a farmer, born and raised in a quiet rural community where fields stretched as far as the eye could see. His hands were calloused from years of hard work under the sun, and his face carried the lines of someone who had lived through both joy and struggle. Today he wore his best suit, the one he saved for weddings, funerals, and moments when life demanded respect. But even though it was clean and pressed, it still showed signs of wear, much like the man himself. His case wasn't complicated, at least not to him. He was fighting to keep the land his family had owned for generations. According to old documents passed down through the years, his ancestors had bought the property decades ago, long before any disputes arose. Now, some fancy developers claimed the land belonged to them, citing what they called new evidence. But the farmer knew better. He'd grown up playing in those fields, planting crops alongside his father, and teaching his own kids how to care for livestock. That land wasn't just dirt. It was home. As he sat there waiting for his turn, his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't used to being in courtrooms. Most days he spent hours outside, working the soil or fixing fences. This place, with its sharp suits, strict rules, and cold atmosphere, felt foreign to him. Still, he clutched the folder in his lap tightly, gripping it like it might disappear if he let go. Inside were all the documents he needed to prove his case: faded deeds, handwritten letters, and even photographs showing his family standing on the very land they now fought to protect. Finally, the clerk called his name. The sound echoed through the room, breaking the steady hum of conversation. For a second he froze, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Then slowly, he stood up, straightening his shoulders as if trying to grow taller. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the front of the courtroom, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he forced himself to keep moving. At the bench sat Judge Patricia Langley, a woman known for her stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach. She glanced at him briefly, her eyes scanning over his worn suit and weathered face. When he began speaking, his southern drawl filled the room. Each word came out slow and deliberate, shaped by years of living in the countryside. To some it might have sounded charming, but to others it was an easy target. Judge Langley wasn't immune to stereotypes. As she listened to him speak, a smirk tugged at the corners of her mouth. Without thinking twice, she leaned forward slightly and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, this should be interesting." The comment hung in the air like smoke after a firecracker. The courtroom fell silent, save for a few nervous chuckles from spectators who didn't know whether to laugh or cringe. The farmer's cheeks flushed red, embarrassment washing over him like a wave. For a moment he considered stepping back, retreating into the shadows where he wouldn't have to face the judge's condescending gaze. But then something inside him shifted. Instead of shrinking away, he squared his shoulders and looked directly at the judge. There was no anger in his expression, only determination. He realized that if he didn't stand up for himself right then and there, no one else would, and so, clearing his throat, he prepared to say something that would change the course of the entire hearing. Little did anyone know, the next 30 seconds would leave an impression on everyone in that room and make the judge regret her words almost instantly. The farmer stood there feeling the weight of the judge's comment pressing down on him. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, some curious, some sympathetic, and a few mocking. The smirk on Judge Langley's face hadn't faded yet, and it stung more than he cared to admit. But instead of letting that sting break him, something inside him hardened. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like a quiet fire, the kind that burned slow but steady, refusing to be extinguished. He took another deep breath, steadying himself. His hands, still gripping the folder tightly, loosened just a bit as he reminded himself why he was here. This wasn't about proving himself to the judge or anyone else in the room. This was about protecting what mattered most, the land that had been in his family for generations, land that held stories, memories, and dreams, land that meant survival, dignity, and identity. Your Honor, he began again, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. I understand my way of speaking might sound funny to some folks. He paused for a moment, letting the words settle. There was no bitterness in his tone, only calm honesty. But I reckon what matters most is whether I'm telling the truth. Foe. Room stayed silent. The kind of silence where you could almost hear people leaning forward in their seats. Even Judge Langley seemed taken aback by the shift in his demeanor. Gone was the nervousness she'd seen earlier. In its place was a man who looked like he belonged in that courtroom just as much as anyone else. With deliberate care, he opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. Each document was worn from years of being handled, folded, and unfolded countless times. Some were yellowed with age, others marked with coffee stains from late nights spent going over them. He held them up for everyone to see, even though they couldn't read the details from where they sat. These here are deeds, he explained, pointing to one of the papers. They go all the way back to my great-grandfather. He bought this, land fair and square in 1923, worked it with his own two hands and passed it down to my grandfather. And then my daddy, and now me. His voice softened slightly as he added, that land ain't just dirt, it's home. He glanced around the room, making eye contact with a few people in the crowd. Some nodded, others looked away, but he didn't need their approval. What he needed was for them to listen, to really hear him. And let me tell you something else, he continued, his voice growing stronger. We've had our share of hard times. Droughts, floods, bad harvests. You name it, we've been through it. But we never gave up, not once, because that land, it's more than just a piece of property, it's a promise. A promise that no matter how tough things get, we can stand tall because we've got roots. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. People shifted in their seats, whispering to each other. Some were nodding along, clearly moved by his words. Others exchanged skeptical glances, unsure if they believed him or thought he was just spinning a good story. But the farmer didn't care about winning them over. Not yet. Right now, his focus was on the woman sitting behind the bench. Judge Langley watched him intently, her expression unreadable. She tapped her pen lightly against the desk, a habit she had when deep in thought. For a brief moment, her earlier smirk returned, but it faltered almost immediately. Something about the man's sincerity was hard to ignore. He wasn't polished, or rehearsed like the lawyers who usually stood before her. There was a rawness to him, an authenticity that made it impossible to dismiss him outright. Encouraged by the subtle shift in her demeanor, the farmer pressed on. He reached into the folder again and pulled out a photograph. It was old, the edges frayed and the colors faded, but the image was clear enough. In it, a younger man stood proudly in front of a weathered barn, holding a pitchfork in one hand and smiling wide. Behind him, rows of crops stretched toward the horizon. This here's my granddaddy, he said, holding the photo up for everyone to see. That's him standing right on that same piece of land in 1947. You can see the barn we built with our own hands. My daddy helped raise those walls, and so did I when I was just a boy. He paused, letting the picture speak for itself. Then, lowering his voice just a fraction, he added, Now, Your Honor, I ain't got much schooling. Never finished high school, truth be told. But I know what's mine. And I also know when someone's laughing at me because they think I don't belong here. His gaze locked onto Judge Langley's, unwavering and piercing. The smirk that had lingered on her face moments ago disappeared completely. For the first time since the hearing began, she looked uncomfortable, maybe even guilty. The courtroom fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. But let me tell you something, he said, his voice rising slightly, filled with quiet defiance. If laughter could take away what's rightfully ours, none of y'all would have anything left either. The words hit like a punch, resonating through the room. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by murmurs of agreement. Even the bailiff, who had been standing stoically near the door, shifted uncomfortably. Judge Langley stared at the farmer, her pen frozen mid-tap. 30 seconds. That's all it took for the atmosphere in the courtroom to change entirely. When the farmer finally lowered the photograph and stepped back, the room felt different. The judge's earlier confidence seemed shaken, replaced by a flicker of doubt. The spectators, once passive observers, now leaned forward with anticipation, eager to see what would happen next. And the farmer? He stood tall, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing steady. Whatever came next, he knew he'd done everything he could to make his voice heard. For the first time that day, the outcome of the case felt uncertain, and that uncertainty was enough to make everyone hold their breath. The courtroom was eerily quiet after the farmer's final words hung in the air. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind of stillness that comes when people are processing something unexpected, something powerful. The judge sat frozen behind her bench, her pen resting forgotten on the desk. Her earlier smirk had vanished completely, replaced by an expression that hovered between discomfort and contemplation. For a moment, no one moved. Even the bailiff, who usually stood as stiff as a statue, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, breaking the spell slightly. The farmer didn't flinch. He'd said what he needed to say, and now it was out there, in the open, impossible to ignore. His hands were steady as he placed the old photograph back into the folder, careful not to crease it further. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on him, but instead of shrinking under their gaze, he felt oddly calm. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about standing firm, even when the odds seemed stacked against him. Judge Langley cleared her throat, snapping herself out of whatever thoughts had been swirling in her mind. She glanced down at the papers in front of her, then back up at the man standing before her. There was something different in her demeanor now, less dismissive, more thoughtful. She tapped her pen once, twice, then set it aside altogether. "All right," she said, her voice softer than before. "Let's take a short recess. I need to review these documents more thoroughly." Her words sent a ripple through the courtroom. People exchanged glances, some nodding approvingly while others whispered excitedly among themselves. A recess? That was unusual for a case like this, especially so early in the proceedings. To the farmer, it felt like a small victory, not the kind that wins battles, but the kind that shifts momentum. He nodded respectfully, stepped back to his seat, and exhaled deeply for the first time in what felt like hours. As soon as the judge disappeared into her chambers, the room erupted into hushed conversations. Spectators leaned over benches. Lawyers scribbled notes furiously, and reporters jotted down details for their stories. But the real action happened near the back of the courtroom, where a group of locals had gathered to support the farmer. They surrounded him immediately, patting him on the shoulder and offering words of encouragement. "You did good, real good," one older man said, his voice gruff but warm. "She won't forget those words anytime soon." Another woman handed him a bottle of water. "Here, drink this. You've earned it." The farmer accepted the bottle with a grateful smile, though his mind was still racing. He hadn't expected things to go this way. Sure, he'd hoped to make his point clearly, but he hadn't anticipated the impact his words would have, not just on the judge, but on everyone else in the room. As he sipped the water, he noticed a young girl sitting nearby, watching him intently. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her braids tied neatly with ribbons. When she saw him looking at her, she smiled shyly and gave him a thumbs up. That simple gesture hit him harder than anything else that day. It reminded him why he was fighting, not just for himself but for future generations. For kids like her, who deserved to grow up knowing their roots mattered, that their history was worth protecting. While the farmer took a moment to gather his thoughts, others sprang into action. One of the local attorneys, a middle-aged man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, approached him cautiously. "Mind if I take a look at those documents?" he asked, gesturing toward the folder. "I might be able to help organize them better for when we resume." The farmer hesitated for a second, then nodded and handed over the folder. He trusted the man. He'd seen him around town often enough to know he was decent folk. Together, they spread the papers out on a nearby table, sorting through deeds, letters, and photographs. Other supporters pitched in too, pointing out key details or suggesting ways to present the evidence more effectively. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, word of what had happened began to spread. Someone posted about it on social media, sharing snippets of the farmer's speech. Within minutes, comments poured in from all over, people praising his courage, sharing similar stories of land disputes, and calling for justice. Locals who hadn't been able to attend the hearing started arriving in droves, filling the hallway outside the courtroom. Some brought signs hastily scrawled with messages like, "Protect our land," and "Justice for farmers." Others simply came to show solidarity, their presence speaking louder than any words could. By the time the recess ended, the energy in the courthouse had transformed entirely. What had started as a routine legal proceeding had turned into something bigger, a rallying cry for fairness, respect, and recognition of the struggles faced by rural communities. And at the center of it all stood the farmer, quietly resolute as he returned to his seat. When Judge Langley re-entered the courtroom, her expression was harder to read than ever. She adjusted her glasses, shuffled through her notes, and finally addressed the room. "We'll reconvene shortly," she announced, her tone measured. "But let me be clear. This court takes claims of ownership seriously, and I intend to ensure that all evidence is reviewed thoroughly." Her statement drew murmurs of approval from the crowd. It wasn't a guarantee of victory, but it was progress. And sometimes progress was enough to keep hope alive. The farmer listened carefully, absorbing her words without letting his guard down. He knew the fight wasn't over yet. In fact, it might only be getting started. But as he glanced around the room, at the supporters packing the benches, the reporters jotting down notes, and the young girl still smiling at him, he realized something important. He wasn't alone anymore. This wasn't just his battle. It belonged to everyone who believed in doing what was right. And with that realization, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever happened next, he was ready. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. The farmer sat upright in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the folder now neatly organized by the local attorney who had stepped in to help. Around him, the crowd buzzed with quiet anticipation. People shifted in their seats, leaning forward as if bracing themselves for what was about to come. Even Judge Langley seemed different this time, her usual briskness tempered by a sense of gravity that hadn't been there before. The judge adjusted her glasses and began speaking. "Before we proceed," she said, addressing the room but looking directly at the farmer, "I want to clarify something. This court operates on facts, not assumptions or biases." Her voice carried a note of seriousness, almost as if she were reminding herself as much as everyone else. Then turning toward the farmer, she added, "Mr." She paused briefly, glancing at her notes. "You may continue presenting your case." For the first time since the hearing began, the farmer felt a flicker of optimism, not because he believed the judge was suddenly on his side, but because he could see the shift in her attitude. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and progress, no matter how small, gave him strength. He stood up slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance. His legs still felt heavy from hours of sitting, but his mind was sharp. He took a deep breath and began again, his voice steady and clear. "Your Honor," he started, "thank you for giving me another chance to explain my side." This time he didn't rush. Instead, he walked the judge and everyone else in the room through each piece of evidence carefully, explaining its significance step by step. First, he showed the original deed signed decades ago by his great-grandfather. The ink had faded over the years, but the signature was unmistakable, a bold scrawl that spoke of pride and determination. "This right here proves ownership," he said, pointing to the document. "It's dated 1923, long before any disputes ever came up. My family has lived on that land, worked that land, and loved that land ever since." Next, he held up letters written by neighbors and friends who had known his family for generations. These weren't just random testimonials. They were personal accounts from people who had witnessed firsthand how hard his ancestors had worked to build a life on that soil. One letter came from an elderly woman whose family had once shared a fence line with his. Another was from a retired teacher who remembered visiting the farm as a child during school trips organized by the community. "These folks ain't got nothing to gain by lying," the farmer explained. "They're telling the truth because they saw it with their own eyes." As he spoke, the judge listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. Gone was the smirk that had greeted him earlier. Now her face was unreadable, though hints of curiosity peeked through. She asked questions too, clarifications about dates, signatures, and property boundaries. Each question felt like a test, but the farmer answered them calmly, drawing from years of knowledge passed down through his family. Then came the photographs, the ones he'd shown earlier, along with a few new ones he'd dug out during the recess. There was one of his father standing next to a tractor, grinning proudly despite the dirt smudged across his face. Another showed his grandmother hanging laundry on a clothesline while chickens pecked at the ground nearby. And then there was the barn photo again, the same one he'd used earlier to make his point. "That barn," he said, tapping the picture gently, "was built by my granddaddy and his brothers. They didn't have fancy tools back then, just hammers, nails, and sweat. But they built it strong enough to last for decades. That barn is proof of what we've done, not just to survive, but to thrive." By now, the entire courtroom was captivated. Even the bailiff, who usually kept his expression neutral, looked impressed. People nodded along with the farmer's words, some whispering quietly to each other about how inspiring it all was. Outside, supporters continued to gather, holding signs and chanting slogans that echoed faintly through the courthouse windows. But the real turning point came when the farmer pulled out one final piece of evidence: a map. Not just any map, but a hand-drawn one created by his grandfather in the 1950s. It outlined every inch of the property, including landmarks like the creek that ran along the western edge and the oak tree where his mother used to hang swings for her kids. "This map," he said, laying it on the table so the judge could examine it closely, "shows exactly where our land begins and ends. It matches up perfectly with the deeds and the surveys we've submitted. If anyone doubts it, they can go out there and see for themselves." Judge Langley studied the map carefully, her brow furrowing as she compared it to the official documents in front of her. After a long moment, she leaned back in her chair, removed her glasses, and sighed deeply. It was a sound that carried weight, a mixture of frustration, reflection, and maybe even regret. "All right," she said finally, her voice firm, but tinged with something softer. "We'll need to review everything further, including testimony from experts who can verify these claims. But based on what I've seen today, I cannot dismiss this case outright." The room erupted into murmurs of approval. For the farmer, those words felt monumental. They weren't a win yet, but they were validation, a sign that his voice had been heard and taken seriously. As he returned to his seat, the crowd erupted into quiet applause, careful not to disrupt the proceedings. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away quickly. This wasn't the time to cry. There was still work to be done. Outside the courthouse, the energy was contagious. Supporters cheered and hugged each other, celebrating the small but significant victory. Reporters scrambled to interview anyone willing to talk, capturing footage of the growing crowd. Someone brought a guitar and started playing a soulful tune, while others joined in singing old gospel songs. It was as if the entire town had come together to rally behind the farmer, not just for him, but for what he represented: resilience, justice, and the unbreakable bond between people and the land they call home. Back inside, the farmer sat quietly, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about his parents, his grandparents, and all the sacrifices they'd made to keep the farm alive. He thought about the young girl in the courtroom who had given him a thumbs up, reminding him why this fight mattered. And he thought about the road ahead, knowing full well that challenges still lay in wait. But for now, he allowed himself to feel hope. Because sometimes, hope is the most powerful thing you can carry into battle. By the time the farmer stepped out of the courthouse that evening, the scene outside had transformed into something extraordinary. What had started as a small gathering of friends and neighbors had grown into a full-blown show of solidarity. People lined the streets holding handmade signs with messages like, "Stand strong and roots run deep." Some had brought pots of food, fried chicken, cornbread, collard greens, spreading the scent of comfort through the cool night air. Others clapped rhythmically, creating an infectious energy that made it impossible not to feel moved. The farmer paused at the top of the courthouse steps, momentarily overwhelmed by what he saw. He hadn't expected this kind of support, not in his wildest dreams. For years he'd carried the weight of his family's struggle alone, shouldering the burden without complaint. But now, looking out at the sea of faces cheering for him, he realized he wasn't carrying it anymore. The load had been shared, passed from his shoulders to the hands of an entire community. A young boy broke away from the crowd and ran up to him, holding out a piece of paper. "Here, mister," the boy said, his voice high-pitched with excitement. "I drew this for you." The drawing was simple but heartfelt. A stick-figure farmer standing beside a barn, surrounded by fields of crops. In big block letters at the Iuzayao. Bottom it read, "You're a hero." The farmer crouched down to the boy's level, smiling despite the lump forming in his throat. "Thank you, son," he said softly, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into his jacket pocket. "This means more than you know." As the boy scampered back to his parents, someone else approached, a woman he recognized from town. She held out a basket filled with fresh-baked bread. "We wanted to do something," she explained, her eyes shining with emotion. "Just a little something to remind you that we're all rooting for you." He accepted the basket with a nod, too choked up to speak. Everywhere he turned, people were offering gestures of kindness, small acts that added up to something enormous. A local mechanic offered to fix his truck free of charge. A teacher promised to write lesson plans about the importance of land rights, using his story as an example. Even strangers who had traveled from neighboring towns showed up to lend their voices, sharing stories of their own battles against injustice. That night, as the farmer drove home, the basket of bread sitting on the passenger seat, he couldn't stop thinking about how much things had changed in just one day. It wasn't just the judge's acknowledgement or the evidence he'd presented. It was the way people had rallied around him. Their support gave him strength, but it also reminded him of something deeper, the power of community. Alone, he might have given up long ago. Together, they could move mountains. The next morning, the farmer woke early, the first light of dawn spilling through his kitchen window. He brewed a pot of coffee, savoring its rich aroma as he sat at the table going over the documents again. Though the judge hadn't ruled yet, he knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more hearings, more questions, and likely more challenges ahead. But instead of feeling daunted, he felt ready to face whatever came next because he wasn't doing it alone. Later that day, volunteers poured into his farmhouse, eager to help however they could. Lawyers reviewed the case files, strategizing ways to strengthen his argument. Historians examined old maps and records, searching for additional proof of ownership. Neighbors pitched in too, cleaning up the yard and fixing fences that had fallen into disrepair. The farmer watched them work, struck by their generosity. These weren't just random acts of goodwill, they were expressions of shared purpose, a collective determination to see justice done. One elderly man, a retired school principal, pulled the farmer aside after lunch. "Listen," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've got your back no matter what happens. But let me tell you something. You've already won half the battle. You stood up when others might have stayed quiet. That takes guts." The farmer nodded, appreciating the sentiment but knowing there was still much to be done. Still, the words stuck with him. Standing up, that was what mattered most. It wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about refusing to stay silent in the face of unfairness. And every person here, whether they were offering legal advice or baking casseroles, understood that. As days turned into weeks, the momentum only grew stronger. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting it far beyond the small town where it had begun. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "Justice for Farmers" and "You Protect Our Land," drawing attention from activists, organizations, and even lawmakers. Donations poured in to cover legal fees and petitions circulated online, urging authorities to take action. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during a community meeting held in the local church. The pews were packed with people of all ages, races, and backgrounds, united by a common goal. As the farmer stood at the front addressing the crowd, he felt a surge of gratitude so profound it nearly brought him to tears. "I didn't think anyone would care," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I thought I was fighting this alone, but seeing all of you here today, it tells me we're stronger together than any of us are apart." The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the wooden walls. When the noise finally died down, a young woman stood up, clutching a microphone. "We're not just fighting for your land," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "We're fighting for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, for everyone who's been laughed at, dismissed, or pushed aside. This isn't just your story, it's ours." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. The farmer nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. This fight wasn't just about reclaiming property, it was about reclaiming dignity, respect, and the right to exist without apology. It was about proving that no matter who you are or where you come from, your voice matters. With renewed determination, the farmer prepared for the next round of hearings. Armed with stacks of evidence, a team of dedicated supporters, and an unshakable belief in what was right, he walked back into the courtroom ready to face whatever came next. This time, though, he wasn't just representing himself. He was standing for every farmer, every family, and every dream tied to the soil beneath their feet. And as he took his seat, waiting for the judge to enter, he allowed himself a small smile. No matter what happened, he knew one thing for certain. The tide was turning. Justice might take time, but it was within reach, and he wouldn't stop until he grabbed hold of it. The day of the final hearing arrived, and the courthouse was packed to the brim. People spilled out into the hallway, standing shoulder to shoulder just to catch a glimpse of what would happen next. The farmer walked in with his head held high, flanked by supporters who had become like family over the past weeks. There was the retired school principal who had offered quiet wisdom, the young woman whose passionate speech at the church meeting still echoed in everyone's minds, and countless others who had poured their hearts into this fight. They weren't just there as spectators, they were part of the story now. Judge Langley entered the room, her expression unreadable as always. She carried a thick stack of papers in her hands, evidence of the long hours she'd spent reviewing every detail of the case. The courtroom fell silent as she took her seat, adjusting her glasses before addressing the room. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, she began, her voice steady but deliberate. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff." For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself had frozen. Then slowly the farmer exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for months. Around him, people erupted into cheers, some clapping wildly while others hugged each other tightly. Tears streamed down faces, not just from joy but from relief. Relief that justice had finally been served. But Judge Langley wasn't done yet. She paused, letting the noise settle slightly before continuing. "This ruling is based not only on the undeniable proof of ownership provided, but also on the principle that everyone deserves fair treatment under the law, regardless of how they speak, where they come from, or what they look like." Her words struck a chord, especially when she added, "I regret my earlier behavior during these proceedings. It was inappropriate and reflected poorly on this court. I hope today's decision helps restore faith in our system." The farmer sat quietly, absorbing her apology. He didn't need her to say it, he knew she meant it. Her acknowledgement wasn't about him personally. It was about recognizing the harm caused by bias and prejudice. For many in the room, those few sentences carried as much weight as the verdict itself. It was a step toward accountability, a reminder that even those in power must answer for their actions. When the hearing ended, the farmer stepped outside to find the crowd waiting for him. This time, the celebration was bigger than ever. Music played, children laughed, and strangers embraced like old friends. Someone handed him a megaphone, urging him to say a few words. At first he hesitated. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, But then he realized this moment belonged to everyone who had stood by him. "I'm not gonna lie," he started, his voice cracking slightly from emotion. "There were days when I thought we'd never get here. Days when it felt like the whole world was against us, but you know what? We kept going. Together." He paused, scanning the sea of faces before him. Some were smiling, others crying, but all were listening intently. "This victory, it ain't just mine. It belongs to every single one of you. To the folks who brought food, prayed for us, donated money, and showed up when we needed you most. You reminded me that no matter how hard things get, we're stronger together." His words were met with thunderous applause, followed by chants of "Justice" and "We did it," as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the scene. The farmer felt a deep sense of peace, not because the battle was over, but because he knew the fight had sparked something bigger, a movement rooted in unity and resilience. In the weeks that followed, the farmer's story spread far beyond the small town. News outlets covered it extensively, highlighting not just the legal victory but the community effort behind it. Schools incorporated his case into lessons about civil rights and perseverance. Organizations formed to support farmers facing similar challenges, ensuring that no one else would have to fight alone. Back home, life began to return to normal, or as close to normal as possible after such a monumental event. The farmer spent his days tending to the land, planting new crops and repairing fences alongside neighbors who had become lifelong friends. Every morning, as he sipped coffee on the porch, he looked out at the fields and remembered why he'd fought so hard. That land wasn't just dirt. It was a testament to survival, love, and legacy. One evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, he found himself thinking about the young boy who had given him the drawing. He pulled it out of his pocket, smoothing the crumpled paper, carefully. "You're a hero," it read. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. If anything, he thought, heroes were the people who had stood beside him, the ones who refused to let injustice win. Years later, the farm thrived, not just as a place to grow crops, but as a symbol of hope. Visitors came from miles away to see the barn built by hand, the oak tree that shaded generations, and the fields that told stories of struggle and triumph. And though the scars of the past remained, they served as reminders of battles fought and won, not just for him, but for future generations. As the farmer grew older, he often stood on the porch watching the sunset, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He knew his legacy wouldn't be measured in acres or harvests, but in the lives he'd touched and the change he'd inspired. In that moment, surrounded by the land he loved and the people who believed in him, he felt truly at peace. Because sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting what's yours. It's about proving that dignity, respect, and justice are worth fighting for. And that lesson, he hoped, would live on long after he was gone.